Hi, my name is Aradia Bansal, and I, in virtual form obviously, am here to present to you my 500 Miles project about Middle Eastern terrorism. Let's get started with an overview of my 5 essential questions. In the order that I'm going to talk about them, they are: who or what drove the beginning of terrorism in the Middle East? What has North America done now and in the past to counter Middle Eastern terrorism? Why and in what ways does terrorism affect the Middle Eastern countries? How does Middle Eastern terrorism affect the lives of Muslims living in first world countries? And what would a world without terrorism from the Middle East look like? How can we make this a reality? I have put a lot of research and my own thought into answering these questions, so I hope that by the end of the presentation, you will have gained a better understanding of the facts about Middle Eastern terrorism and be able to put your own insight on the matter. Let's get started. So, how did terrorism from the Middle East really come to be? Terrorism in the Middle East derived from the mental thinking that terrorism could be effective in reaching political goals. This is also a main reason that countries like Pakistan support terrorist groups, to balance their need for political and economic reform with a domestic religious agenda, while acting as a further transit area between the Middle East and South Asia. The 9/11 attacks, some of the most tragic in history, are a big reason why major extremist groups are more willing to attack foreign countries, seeing as an attack as big as 9/11 has happened before. Different religious extremist groups have different reasons for their actions. An example being Al-Qaeda, whose goals are to re-establish the Muslim state throughout the world by overthrowing corrupt regimes in the Islamic world and the removal of foreign presence. Sometimes, terrorism can be done for no reason at all, as there are 2 main types of terrorism, rational and irrational. Rational terrorism is usually done with a goal in mind, and is the more common of the two, but there are some psychopathic people in the world that commit violent acts like terrorism because of mental disabilities. It is very difficult to solve this problem, and also to present punishment. Most terrorism in the Middle East, however, comes from religious background. Knowing that terrorism itself has proved to be a huge threat to both Canada and the United States, I began to wonder what we've really done to counter terrorism in the past, the present, and the nation's plans for the future. America has done many different things to try and counter terrorism, which includes militaristic approaches on specific groups and also adopting different research projects and policies in the country to understand motives. Recently, America has launched 946 airstrikes on the terrorist group ISIS in an attempt to disrupt, dismantle, and eventually defeat the terrorist groups to ensure safety of Americans above all costs. The official goals of the Americans when it comes to counterterrorism. The nation gives its best efforts into gaining support from other countries, as they believe that their fight with Middle Eastern terrorism cannot be fought alone. Since the increase in attacks, the government even established a Counterterrorism Act, which promotes how the situation will be handled to citizens, creating trust to stop the recruitment of citizens into terrorist groups. Big social media companies like Twitter are also trying to help. Twitter has took the initiative to block ISIS-related comments from their network in an attempt to reduce the effect of ISIS on the site's users. Most of the fight is coming from the USA, but even Canada is trying to play its part. They have introduced an anti-terror legislation, Bill C-51, that gives Canada's spy agency broad powers to disrupt alleged plots, allow suspects to be detained without charge for longer, and let the government share information more widely. All this talk about what first world countries must do to counter the effects of Middle Eastern terrorism really takes away from the bigger picture. Many people seem to forget that the biggest effect of this terrorism doesn't take place in North America, but actually in the Middle Eastern nations themselves. In the 2012 Global Terrorism Index, Iraq was said to be the country most affected by terrorism, followed by Pakistan and Afghanistan. America is actually one of the least likely countries to be affected by terrorism, but when they use counter-terrorism tactics, many innocent Middle Easterners are caught in crossfire. The terrorism that comes from the Middle East actually even lowers the region's economy in many ways. Terrorism lowers human and labor resources, creates an environment of uncertainty which has a negative impact on domestic and international consumption and investment, reduce government funds which are used more strongly to support counterterrorism security as opposed to education and healthcare, and plummet the growth of major industries like tourism, lowering total revenue of the country.
Created using Powtoon.